We're talking baseball here on the Baseball Talk Radio Show.
And hello and welcome to the Baseball Talk Radio Show, episode number 3.20. I'm your host, Gary Mack, and I hope everyone had a great couple of weeks. Took last week off as a little bit of a Labor Day weekend vacation thing, had some family in, so hope you'll come back and listen to the show. Have a terrific show today, a little bit different. We're going to get pretty much early to the interview. We're not going to do a lot of back stuff, but really want to get to this interview because it's such a great interview, and it's a little bit lengthy, and I don't want to keep you forever, so I hope you will enjoy it. But just wanted to say that the pennant races are heating up. Some of them are pretty well set already. Some of them look like they're going to go right down to the wire, so check that out in baseball, and we'll cover that a little bit more next week's show. But special show today about Babe Ruth, and you're not going to want to miss it. So let's take a quick break here and come back in just a second.
Baseball and BBQ, your place for interesting baseball talk, opinions, and history.
Baseball and BBQ, your place for barbecue recipes, tips, and interviews from the world of barbecue. If you like baseball and if you like barbecue, then tune in to Baseball and BBQ. Find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and BaseballTalkRadio.com, along with Mets Musings and other great baseball podcasts.
On August 16th, we celebrated marked the death of a legend in baseball history, and that is the death of Babe Ruth. And my guest today, Jerry Amernic, has a book out that discusses the life and times of the Babe and his legacy. And Jerry, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Gary. It's very good to be here with you.
Jerry, 70 years ago, the Babe passed away, and yet his legend or his memory or his legacy still endures. What is it about Babe Ruth that people still are enamored about?
Well, Gary, this is what I tried to capture in my book. It's called Babe Ruth, A Superstar's Legacy, and I've been researching Babe Ruth for a number of years, and I think the guy is a very intriguing personality, and his the endurance of Ruth and his legacy goes far beyond baseball, goes far beyond sport, and that's something I get into in my book. So if I could just explain, I got involved with Ruth many years ago. I'm a writer of both fiction and nonfiction books. And I should add, I'm not a sports writer per se, though I've written many articles over the years to do with sports. But my first novel was published in 2004, and it was called Gift of the Bambino. And it was a coming-of-age story about a young boy and his grandfather and how they were bound by baseball and Babe Ruth. And the book gets into a lot of historical flashbacks, and it gets into, in fact, Babe Ruth is a character in the book as well, even though it's a work of fiction. Mm-hmm. So to make a long story short, I did a lot of research on Babe Ruth, and I just got very intrigued with the guy. And eventually I met Tom Stevens, who is Babe Ruth's grandson. His mother is Julia Ruth Stevens, daughter of Babe Ruth, who just in July turned 102. She's still alive and still going strong. So I met Tom, and I mentioned this idea about writing a book about the legacy of Babe Ruth. There have been countless books about Ruth, of course, biographies, memoirs, picture books, kids' books, novels, you name it, but no one has ever done a book about the legacy of Babe Ruth. So that's what this was about. Tom Stevens came on board, and he was kind enough to write the foreword to the book, and he did. So the book came out actually in the spring, and it gets into the legacy of Ruth on many different fronts. I should say it's not a biography, though there are a lot of biographical points in the book, but it's about the enduring legacy of Ruth, and it gets into things to do with his impact at Cooperstown, the sports memorabilia, sports collecting industry, which today is a $1 billion industry. I said billion with a B. And he is far and away the number one commodity in that industry. 6 years ago, his 1920 Yankees jersey sold at auction for $4.4 million, which is still a Guinness World Record for an item of sports memorabilia. So it gets into things like that, film, the arts, literature, even the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the first chapter in the book talks about the exhibit of portraiture and artwork to do with Babe Ruth, which was held at the Smithsonian in Washington. It just wound up in June 2017. And the curator of that exhibit, who's a historian no less, told me he still thinks Babe Ruth is the most famous American name in the world, not just for an athlete, but period. So the book explores this legacy. So to get back to your question, what is it about him? I like to use the term the perfect storm, that when he went from the Red Sox to the Yankees and joined the Yankees for the 1920 season, he was already the biggest name in baseball, by the way, but you had a perfect storm. You had the dawn of the Roaring '20s. That was the time. The place, New York City, the Big Apple. And you had this enormous charismatic personality of Babe Ruth. And these three things came together and created the legend of Babe Ruth. And legend is an interesting word, because when it comes to Babe Ruth, the legend is very much the fact. And that doesn't happen with too many people. So I think that's what happened, and that's why I think he has endured. But there's also other things about Ruth. He was he was quite a humanitarian as well, and was actually the first athlete philanthropist. So the book also gets into his support of charities. I mean, in the state of Florida alone, where the Red Sox and later the Yankees had spring training, he supported 70 different charities, and he did the same thing when he went to New York City. So he was, I think, frankly, the most loved American athlete in history. And I think all these things came together, and that's why he has endured through the ages.
And you mentioned his humanitarianism, and
yeah,
in today everybody has a foundation, whether it's as for good reasons, of course. Some may use it as a tax shield, whatever. But it seems that when the Babe did it, it was just he felt like he was just helping people.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, well, I've been researching Babe Ruth for, I guess it's, 25 years now, and I actually had met people who knew him, and people involved, say, with the Yankees, who certainly knew players that had mixed with Babe Ruth, and I've never come across anyone who didn't like Babe Ruth. I mean, it sounds kind of, cliche, I guess, but I just haven't. The guy just was genuine. He certainly had his flaws. He wasn't a formally educated guy by any means. He was very rough around the edges, but he just had this love of people, and I think the people loved him back. And of course, by the way, he was also the greatest baseball player in history, a great pitcher who later became the greatest hitter. So it's quite a combination.
And that's something in itself that when you think about it, for years he held the World Series record for scoreless innings.
As a pitcher, yes.
As a pitcher, and the home run prowess, and we're starting to see a little bit of that today with Ohtani, and as a young man in the minors that is a pitcher and a first baseman. But you don't see that two-way player anymore, and he was just such a larger-than-life character.
Oh, he certainly was. But you mentioned Shohei Ohtani, who's been depicted as the second coming of Babe Ruth, and I mean the guy is a phenomenon, of course. I mean, as a pitcher and a hitter. Of course, now they say he is now a good candidate for Tommy John surgery, so we don't know what's going to happen to his pitching career. But I think it's a little premature to call him the second coming of Babe Ruth. Maybe 700 home runs from now we can say that. But the thing that a lot of people, maybe younger people, don't know about Ruth is that when he came up to the major leagues, he was a pitcher. And his first 3-4 years with the Boston Red Sox, he was the best left-handed pitcher in the American League. This is a guy who would have made the Hall of Fame as a pitcher, even if he had never been an everyday player. So, I mean, think about that. I don't think you can say that about any other ball player. So he really was unique in that regard.
And he had such a troubling upbringing as a kid. Had a rough childhood and all. Do you touch about that in the book at all?
Yeah, no, for sure. We get into it. In fact, I should mention the book is available on Amazon and at my website, which is BabeRuthLegacy.com. And on that website, I've posted interviews I did with people who helped me with the book. And one of those interviews, by the way, is with Julia Ruth Stevens, his daughter. And that interview was done a few years ago when she was living in New Hampshire at her home. And as she told me stories about her father, which are incredible. I mean, if people are really interested in this, I would suggest they go to the website and listen to some of those interviews. But the book does get into his youth, though I want to emphasize again, the book is not a biography.
Right.
But I was asked in an earlier interview about his upbringing, and I said his upbringing, it's the kind of story you could take out of a Dickens novel. He was born in Baltimore on the proverbial, wrong side of the tracks. The house where he was born is now the Babe Ruth Museum and Birthplace in Baltimore. It's like a row house in the old section of Baltimore, and now it's quite a museum. They get a million visitors have gone through there. But his father owned a saloon, and when he was a little boy, the longshoremen, the guys coming off the boats, these are the kind of guys who would visit the bar, and these are the kind of people that he got to know. When he was 7, his parents put him in St. Mary's Industrial School for boys, and he really grew up there, and that's where he learned how to play baseball. So in that regard, it wasn't an orphanage, but that's where he was sent. So in many ways, he was really a guy without a family. So his family was really at St. Mary's, where Brother Matthias was who was really the prefect there and taught him how to play baseball, and he obviously taught him pretty well. So he stayed there till he was 19 when he joined the Boston Red Sox as a pitcher. But it certainly wasn't the most auspicious childhood and upbringing.
Yeah, it's very tough and in a tough time, but he managed to endure. He made it to the majors, and as you say, he was a little rough around the edges, but somehow with that perfect storm, as you put it, he really made a name for him, not only for himself, but a name that continues on today. Do you touch on the effect that he had on baseball as well with the Babe Ruth League and
Yes, we get one chapter. It gets into the Babe Ruth League and how it came about. And again, it's, as they say, it's another element of how he endures, where it really got started in the early 50s, which was just a few years after he died. He died in 1948. His wife, Claire, was his second wife. She's the mother of Julia. Was asked to lend his name to this league for, it was at the time it was teenage boys looking for a place to play baseball. So it was called the Little Bigger League, and they changed it to the Babe Ruth League, and lo and behold, it started growing by leaps and bounds. And today, the Babe Ruth League has over 1 million players. I think they start at age 4, and it goes up to about 18. It includes girls as well. It even includes disabled kids who they teach how to play baseball. So it really cuts across everything. There's 1 million players, and there's 2 million volunteers. That's 3 million people are involved in the Babe Ruth League today. So Steve Tullison, the guy who does a great job running that organization, It just says they preserve the legacy of Ruth, and he said he thinks Babe Ruth would be very proud to know that such an organization has his name and is doing so well today.
I'm sure he certainly would, and he was also a big fan of the game of golf. Can you tell us anything about that in your research?
Well, yeah, there have been a couple terrible movies about Babe Ruth. First in 1948 with William Bendix, and in the 90s with John Goodman, and he was depicted as, a big overweight guy, and I mean, the consummate movie about Babe Ruth really hasn't been made. The fact is, the guy was a superb athlete. When he came up to the majors, he was 6'2" and 190 pounds. And the cover of my book is a picture taken in 1920. This photograph, where it was taken in the Yankees dugout in the 1920 season, and he looks like a young, powerful guy who can hit 700-plus home runs. So the guy had eye-hand coordination that was right off the charts. So he was a superb athlete in every way, pitcher, hitter, even earlier days as a runner, until he actually screwed up one of his knees, ripped up one of his knees when he was with the Red Sox. And believe it or not, that was never repaired until after he retired. So he played his entire Yankees career, if you can believe it, on a bum knee, which a lot of people aren't aware of. But especially after he retired, he didn't start playing golf, but he played a lot more golf after he retired. And he was a superb golfer. As I said, the guy had power, technique, and eye-hand coordination that was off the charts. So that translates into a good recipe for a good golfer, and he was a very good golfer as well. But here's another a wrinkle in the story of Ruth. There's an old story that was attributed to Colonel Rupert, who was the Yankees co-owner, that Babe Ruth, of course, wanted to be a manager after he retired, and it never happened. And the story by Rupert, the line that's often been cited is that how can he manage a team because he can't even manage himself? Well, in fact, there is no evidence that Jacob Rupert ever said that. And I've gone into this story about why Ruth never got to be a manager. In fact, there were 10 different teams in both leagues that had expressed interest in hiring Babe Ruth as a manager, especially towards the end of his career around 1933, 1934. He retired in 35. The thing with Ruth is he had barnstormed against black players and Latino players as early as 1918 when he was with the Red Sox. And he did this throughout his career, even though baseball was segregated. So here's a guy who played against black ball players when it was frowned upon, and he did it when he was the biggest name in baseball. And 10 teams at one time or another had expressed interest in hiring him as a manager. Now, it was the family, Julia the daughter and Tom the grandson, who first told me about this, that I said, if Ruth was a manager, would he have advocated hiring black ball players? And they said yes. And then I met a gentleman named Bill Jenkinson, who's a baseball historian, and he's written a number of books, and he's researched this more than anybody. And his contention is that Ruth never got to be a manager is because of that very reason, that baseball was segregated, and he was no advocate of segregation. And the book gets into that towards the end, that could very well be the reason he never got to be hired as a manager. So that's an interesting story about Ruth that I don't know a lot of people are familiar with.
Wow. That is, I've never heard that story myself, and it's very interesting. I often wondered why, as you just said, they have never been able to make a good movie about Babe Ruth. It just seems, maybe he's too big.
Well, one of my favorite baseball movies is The Sandlot, which was made in the 90s, about these kids that lose a ball that was signed by Babe Ruth, and it goes over the fence in a yard where this monster dog is prowling. And it's a great movie, and I was delighted the time I spent with Julia, Ruth Stevens, Babe's daughter. She told me that was her favorite baseball movie, The Sandlot. So that was a story involving Babe Ruth, but there have been two movies about the life of Babe Ruth that I think both of them were terrible, I use the analogy of getting like John Goodman to play Babe Ruth would be like having Woody Allen play Muhammad Ali, I mean, it's ridiculous. So because I say Ruth is sometimes depicted as this, overweight guy, and he certainly was when he was older, later in his career. But when he was younger, the guy was just a remarkable athlete. Back in 1995 was the 100th year of his birth, the centennial of his birth, and I went to a conference at Hofstra University. They had a 3-day conference called Baseball and the Salt and the Swat, and it was all about Babe Ruth. And one of the sessions there was given by a physicist who did a session examining the intricate dynamics of Babe Ruth's swing, and he had a very unusual way of swinging with his feet close together and a snap of his wrists, whereas most batters, of course, certainly today, they have feet wider apart. But it obviously worked for him pretty well. So the guy was a super athlete for sure. He was also an avid, hunter and a fisherman, and he loved the outdoors, and that's the kind of guy that he was.
Yeah, he bought a farm when he was came to the Yankees, and still a young guy. But I don't know why he is depicted all the time as this heavy, stumbling ball player when he was quite an athlete. I mean, he stole a number of bases in his career as well.
Yeah, and that's right. Early in his career, he was quite a base stealer, and he was an excellent outfielder. They say he never missed the cutoff man once in his career. So he really was, a baseball genius. I mean, he was, and in 1934, the American League All-Stars went to Japan. And he was on that trip, and they were all All-Stars. So managing a team of All-Stars is not an easy thing to do. Guess who the manager of the team was? It was Babe Ruth. He was the manager and player on that team. And one of the people I interviewed for my book is Ryozo Kato, who was the Japanese ambassador to the United States, I think until 2008. And he then became the commissioner of Nippon Professional Baseball, which is the big leagues in Japan. And he talked to me about that trip and the impact that Ruth had on Japan, not only baseball, but on Japanese culture, which has persisted to this day. So that's another element of the book that gets into, the impact of Ruth in different parts of the world, and it's quite profound.
Well, and if you remember some of the World War II movies, they used to use Babe Ruth was an answer to at a checkpoint. They'd ask questions about who was Babe Ruth, and if you
yes, and of course also in the war in the Pacific, when the Japanese were charging U.S. Marines, their battle cry was "To hell with Babe Ruth," because it was the most denigrating thing they could say to Americans. I mean, that's interesting. It wasn't to hell with George Washington or to hell with FDR. It was to hell with Babe Ruth. So, I mean, think about that. That was the most denigrating thing they could say to Americans, and that's what they said. But at the same time, the Japanese revered Babe Ruth, and I think still do. You go to the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame, they have a section there with stuff about Babe Ruth, going back to that 1934 trip. Julia, the daughter, was 18 years old, and she was on that trip, and she has vivid memories. And when I asked her how Babe Ruth was received, when they went to Tokyo, they had a parade with the American League All-Stars in cars, and they had over 500,000 people in the streets, on either side. I said, how was he received? And she said, like he was a god. And like I say, she was 18 and has vivid memories of the trip. So, hearing it from her was quite remarkable.
Now, in your research, how with this, the way the game is played today, would the Babe be able to? I mean, first of all, the money he would demand would probably be astronomical, but how would he fare in today's game?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, in terms of the money, let's look at the money first. His salary peaked at $80,000 a year. Now, this is a guy who also made more doing endorsements and everything else, but his salary peaked at $80,000 a year. So this was during the Great Depression. I mean, that was a lot of money back then for sure, and nobody else made anywhere near that. But even so, $80,000 a year then might be about $1 million a year today. And no star ball player makes $1 million a year. I mean, you could get a guy who's going up and down between the majors and minors making $1 million a year. So the salaries don't compare at all. How would he do today? Well, that's an interesting question. When he was a player, he was likely the biggest guy on the team. He was, 6'2", 190 when he came up, and then maybe 6'2", 215 when he was a little bit older. And later in his career, of course, he got heavier. But he was, a guy 6'2" coming up to the majors in 1914 was a giant, not like today. So, in one way, I mean, the players are bigger today for sure. They're faster, they're stronger. Well, I mean, you look at medical things. I said he ripped up his knee when he was with the Red Sox. Never got repaired until after he retired. You couldn't get a scope on your knee in those days. So the author I mentioned earlier, Bill Jenkinson, who researched the race thing, he also spent many years researching the great power hitters in baseball through the ages. And he looked at things like what you're saying about the size of players, the size of the ballparks, the ball that was used, the uniforms, what they wore, medical expertise at the time compared to today. His conclusion was that Babe Ruth was the strongest power hitter in history, bar none, even right up to today. And this guy was a legal investigator before he became a baseball historian. So he spent something like 30 years looking into this, and that was his conclusion, that Ruth is the best and strongest power hitter ever. I don't know any other ticker tape home runs that went 600 feet, but they did measure one of his that went that far. So it's really hard to say. But I think comparing the 1920s and 1930s to today, they're different eras. But I think one thing is for sure. Nobody changed the game as much as Babe Ruth did. It was the dead ball era, became the live ball home run era, attributable to one guy, Babe Ruth. I mean, he changed the game. And I don't think any other player had the impact that he had.
And of course, as you said earlier about the perfect storm, he came along in the Roaring '20s and everything. But he also came along right after the Black Sox thing.
Yes, that's right.
That was really, he was something that really, well, it wasn't Major League Baseball per se, the corporation that we have today then, but it's something that they really hung their hat on and really saved the game of baseball.
Well, you're right. He did save baseball. I mean, you had the Black Sox scandal, and Shoeless Joe Jackson, one of the players, suspended for life. The guy that Babe Ruth modeled his swing after, by the way, suspended for life in his prime. And the popularity for the game was hitting rock bottom, and that could have killed baseball. I mean, there wasn't competition with football and basketball and other sports in those days. Baseball was the game. It was America's game. And then along comes Babe Ruth, and is hitting home runs, not just out-homering other players, but out-homering teams all by himself. And, there you go. He comes to the Yankees. He hits 54 homers his first season, 59 his second. And the people just poured through the turnstiles. And then in 1923, the Yankees had to build a new stadium, the house that Ruth built. And he did. They needed it to accommodate all the fans. So he saved the game. And it was even mentioned to me, I think at Cooperstown, that they said he saved the game twice because during the Depression, he also revitalized the game because he was still a great star during the Depression. And people came to see him. So you maybe could argue that he saved the game more than once.
Just a remarkable figure in not only baseball history, but in the history of America, as you say.
Exactly.
He was the perfect storm, and everything came together. And it's a wonder. Did his granddaughter ever say? Did he ever feel the pressure of being Babe Ruth at all?
Well, Julia, first of all, is the daughter. Okay, the pressure of being Babe Ruth. Well, I think from what I know, he dealt with that very well. with the pressure, because as the book Babe Ruth, a Superstar's Legacy, it gets into how he handled himself, not just as a baseball player but as a celebrity. The guy was a marketing genius. I mean, he was the first superstar athlete to market himself, and he did this as early as when he was with the Red Sox. He made silent movies and he was a big star. They say he not only invented the home run, but that he invented the autograph. There's an autograph expert who works with a company in the sports memorabilia industry who told me that Babe Ruth signed his signature something like 2 million times during his heyday. And I found that hard to believe. And he worked it out to something like 196 signatures a day. And he said during his heyday with the Yankees, 20s, 30s, and even into the 40s, until he passed away, wherever he went, he was mobbed. And during his playing days, if there were days when they weren't playing, he was mobbed wherever he went, and he always obliged the fans. So, the guy was, I think he dealt with the celebrity very, very well. And the way he dealt with it was he was very accommodating to the fans, and he was sincere and honest, with the fans. So I think that those are key elements of his legacy too. But it also was one of the reasons why anything signed by Babe Ruth is worth a lot of money. A couple months ago, or about a month ago, I was in Cleveland at the National Sports Collectors Convention. And this was a 4-day convention that attracts something like 40,000 people. And it was in this mammoth convention hall, and here it is, 70 years after Ruth has passed away, and he is all over the place. There are posters of him and cards of him and photographs of him, and he's everywhere. The guy's presence just looms over the industry as it looms over baseball. And just the other day, I opened my newspaper, and there's a full-page ad about the called shot home run from the 1932 World Series. And what is it? And he's pointing. It's an ad for a prostate organization encouraging men to have a prostate exam, right? And so they've got Babe Ruth pointing to the outfield, and it's a full-page ad in the newspaper. This just was last week. So, I mean, the guy endures, and like I say, it goes far beyond baseball. It's really a remarkable phenomenon.
It certainly is, and there was always questions of his relationship with Lou Gehrig.
Yeah.
In your research, was there the friction that we are sometimes told there was, or was that just
well, yeah, there was later, in that there was a bit of a problem between the two families that was resolved later. But I mean, during his heyday with the Yankees, they got along very well. In fact, Julia told me a story, which is in my interview, where we talked about Ruth maybe not becoming a manager because of his progressive views on race, right? But there's more to it than that. She told me a story that she knew Lou Gehrig very well, and when Lou Gehrig's contract was coming up with the Yankees, he came to Babe Ruth to ask him what he should do. And Julia tells this story, and it's quite a funny story. And she said, Daddy told him, ask the Colonel for more money. And then Gary said, well, how much should I ask for? And he tells him, and he thought it was too much. And according to the way Julia tells it, Babe told Gehrig, make it difficult for the Colonel. So here's a guy who would have advocated hiring black ball players when it wasn't done, and he would have encouraged players to ask for more money from the owners when most players were treated like indentured servants in those days. So those could be two very good reasons why he never got to be a manager.
And of course, I believe you recently spoke this past summer at Cooperstown in
Yes. Yeah, I was there. Actually, I was there just before induction weekend. I did a presentation at the Hall of Fame. They call it the Bullpen Theater. So I did a presentation, a book signing, and this is pretty cool. On the Saturday of induction weekend, I did a book signing with Tom Stevens, the grandson, who wrote the foreword to the book, at one of the bookstores on Main Street in Cooperstown. So here I am during induction weekend at Cooperstown, doing a book signing with the grandson of Babe Ruth. So I figure it probably doesn't get any better than that.
No, it doesn't, and it's just that I hate to keep saying the word amazing, but it is. Even if you go to Cooperstown today, there is a large section
Yeah.
of dedicated to the Babe. They've got his.
There's a Babe Ruth exhibit there. That's right.
The uniform that he wore when he was dying, and
Yes.
at the Yankee Stadium, went to Babe Ruth Day, is there. It's just an amazing exhibit, and it's just an incredible life story, and as you say, his legacy lives on today. Everybody still knows who he is.
Yeah, no, it's for sure. I mean, there's a chapter there called "The Face of Cooperstown" in the book, and I had interviewed Jeff Idelson, the president of Cooperstown, about his legacy, and like you say, there's an exhibit. There's also an exhibit for Hank Aaron, by the way.
Yes.
But the exhibit on the second floor at the Hall of Fame, the Babe Ruth exhibit, I interviewed Tom Schieber, who's a curator there, who put it together, and he has some interesting observations about Babe Ruth too. And again, it goes beyond baseball. But the guy who might know more about Babe Ruth than anybody is Michael Gibbons. One chapter in my book is about the Babe Ruth Museum in Baltimore. And Michael Gibbons was the director of that for something like 37 years. I think he retired last year, but I know for a fact he's still there 2 or 3 days a week. And this guy may know more about Babe Ruth than anybody, and he tells an interesting story. He's a Baltimore guy, and he told me that for many years he was teaching a college writing course, and he would always ask the students if they know who Babe Ruth is, and never did he come across somebody who didn't know who Babe Ruth was. But by the same token, in more recent years, they may not know, believe it or not, in Baltimore, they've never heard of Brooks Robinson. So, which is crazy, but that's, that's how it is. But everybody has heard of Babe Ruth. So he's the name that everybody knows. And it goes back to the curator at the Smithsonian, who told me in his view, Babe Ruth is still the most known American name in the entire world, which is quite a profound statement coming from a historian at the Smithsonian.
It's just an amazing career and life, and I'm so grateful that you were available today and come on and talk about this wonderful book, and just remind us again where people can get the book.
Yes, it's called Babe Ruth: A Superstar's Legacy. You can buy it on Amazon. Both in print, or you can also buy it as an ebook, or you can get it on my website, which is BabeRuthLegacy.com. And that website has a lot of information, not just about the book, but to do with people who were interviewed for the book. And there's a series of interviews that I think a lot of your listeners might find pretty fascinating.
And Jerry, thanks again so much for coming on the show. And I urge people to go buy this book. Baseball isn't just about the guys that are playing today. There is so much history and so much depth to this game, and so much of it, because of Babe Ruth, is why we're watching today. And so go and learn about this man, because he's just an incredible figure in American history.
He absolutely is. Yes, for sure.
All right. Thanks again, Jerry, and I'll be back right after this.
Okay, thanks.
We'd love to hear your comments. You can reach Gary at baseballtalkradio.com, or me, Rich at baseballtalkradio.com. We'd love to hear your comments, so send them in. Subscribe to the Baseball Talk Radio Show on Stitcher Radio, iTunes, or Podomatic.com. This way you'll never miss an episode. Gary, I think I'm going to go over to baseballtalkradio.com and listen to all the baseball talk shows there. Do you think I can cram it all in on a weekend?
No, I don't think so. It's going to take you quite some time, but there's a little bit of everything there. Cover most of the teams, and Japanese baseball, fantasy baseball, all there at baseballtalkradio.com, the home of great baseball talk shows. And go check it out. It's a great place. And if you'd like to help us out a little bit, you can go to patreon.com, become a sponsor of the show. Help us out. $2 a month, $1 a month, anything you can give it all would be gratefully appreciated, and help us do more of this kind of thing, the video, and expand our capabilities, and maybe some on the road surprises in the summertime. So that's patreon.com/baseball talk. Give whatever you can. We'd greatly appreciate it. Please go and help us out.
You're listening to baseballpodcasts.net.
Wouldn't it be great if you could get a PhD in life through baseball? Welcome to Baseball PhD, a tour company for your brain. 30 major league teams, 100 places to see. Let's touch them all as we make the road trip of a lifetime.
Hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. Always great to talk about the great Bambino. To me, he's the greatest of all time, bar none. Nobody even comes close to Babe Ruth. So glad that we had Jerry on to talk about the Babe and his legacy. And please pick up the book at Amazon and at Jerry's website. So go check it out. All right, that's going to wrap it up for us for today. And this week, I hope that you'll tune in again in the future. And have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next time on the Baseball Talk Radio Show.